Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, for another YouTube video. Allincrypto here, and today we are going to be delivering part 2 to our original video where we were questioning the origins of Bitcoin and thus the real intent behind it. And I'll leave a link to that video in the description. It's well worth a watch. It might even be worth watching before you watch this one. We were really sort of questioning the miracle-esque nature of Bitcoin's appearance and the unknown kind of creator, or the unknown identity of the creator, and just how right it's actually been. You know, if you look at what the problem that Bitcoin came about to address was, it was to do with the fiat systems and really the kind of Ponzi-ish scheme that they are. You know, and since Bitcoin's creation, Bitcoin has been nothing short of right. You know, it's really the problem that it tried and is seeking to address has only gotten bigger and bigger. And today we see the likes of the largest hedge funds in the world all now offering Bitcoin as a product. So there's a lot of things that don't quite align. There's a lot of questions and answers that are to be desired. And thus I think it's important to kind of question perhaps the real intent behind Bitcoin. And I think there's actually some parallels between Bitcoin and how it came into existence and the Federal Reserve, which may sound absolutely absurd, but we'll talk you through that a little bit. The video that we made the other day was a very polarizing one, but it was exactly as I wanted it to be. You know, there was a lot of engagement. We'll look at some of what the comments were towards the end of the video, but the parallel that I'm going to draw between how we ended up with central banking and Bitcoin, it's probably a good place for me to start with exactly how we ended up with the Federal Reserve Act in, I think, 1912 or 1913. But the event that really led up to that, or one of the main events, was, of course, the banking panic of 1907. And you might have heard of the Knickerbocker Bank, the Heinz Bank. 1907 was essentially caused by a similar thing to what happened in 2008. And ultimately, it was the event that happened in 1907 that led to the Federal Reserve Act and the Federal Reserve Bill actually being passed. Again, I think it was 1912, it could have been 1913. But essentially what happened was the very people that sought to centralize banking essentially orchestrated the panic that took place in 1907. And from that, there was the call, just like we see today, to reform monetary policy, because at that time, banking was a lot more kind of privatized than it is today. It wasn't quite as public. You know, we have a central bank today, essentially, that has a monopoly over money and dictates the value of it. Banking wasn't quite like that. There wasn't as much regulations. There wasn't as much of what we have today. But what happened in 1907, you know, Heinz is kind of maybe a little bit comparable to Bear Stearns, and then you had, you know, an equivalent of Lehman that came after, was you had the banking panic. And this ultimately called for the reform of monetary policy, again, like what we have today from many people. And this ultimately led to a number of individuals that had the largest banks at the time, the kind of international banking cartel, coming together at Jekyll Island and essentially plotting to centralize banking. And they ultimately drafted up, first of all, the Aldrich Bill, which was rejected due to its involvement, or fears of its involvement, with Wall Street. And then they basically snuck the same bill pretty much in through the other door in the name of taking the powers of banking away from Wall Street and having it essentially put in a more suitable custodian's hands, and thus you had the Federal Reserve Bill and the banking system that we have today. That's where it all kind of started from, and we know what happened with the gold standards and things like that from there on out. But if you look at that comparable of what led to monetary reform in the forms of a central bank being formed in the United States, and where we are today in regards to the central banking system, the fiat systems that we currently have, literally being a dying horse, and a new one offered up to us in the form of Bitcoin, You know, I think there is really some comparables there, and it sounds absurd. And we did say at the start of that video, and I'm going to say it again, you know, we are long Bitcoin. We're essentially short the central bank systems and the fiat systems. We understand that they're proliferation systems. If you look at the proliferation that's happened, and you understand that a fiat currency is really just an IOU, money comes into existence through borrowing and lending. And if you've seen what's happened with balance sheets in regards to debt and things like this, you know, there's no other alternative other than entirely new monetary reform. And the fact that Bitcoin came about literally at the perfect time has made me and makes me very skeptical. And to compound that, you have things like nobody actually knows who Satoshi is. So I own Bitcoin, I'm long Bitcoin. We were one of the first people back into the market after the 2022 bear market. We were getting in Bitcoin around about 15, 16K. It's all publicly available. And again, I'm really short the fiat systems. So I think Bitcoin is a great alternative to the fiat systems that we have. However, is it the road to freedom? I don't know. And I'm not sure anybody does at this point. I'm sure somebody perhaps does, perhaps the people who are really behind Bitcoin. I don't know who that is. I question the origins of it and thus the intent. And I do think it's a very interesting comparable looking at how we ended up with central banking and where we are today with Bitcoin kind of being perhaps, or blockchain being perhaps the alternative to the current monetary policy that we have. You know, there's one reason I love the cryptocurrency space is not just from a technological standpoint, it's also from a philosophical one. I think Bitcoin is almost more social than it is technological. Bitcoin is old technology in regards to blockchain at this point, but we won't go down that rabbit hole and offend the Bitcoin maximalists even more than we perhaps already have by making the first video and thus this one. And the aim of these videos is not to offend. I have no pleasure out of offending anybody, but what I want is to encourage people to question and ask the questions in regards to Bitcoin's origins that nobody seems to answer, but everyone seems okay with that. And we had some great comments to our last video. One comment that I thought was absolutely brilliant was people said, well, who cares who's actually behind Bitcoin because we have it today and it works. And it does work, but Bitcoin, people seem to believe that Bitcoin is absolutely immutable, which means that it can't fail and there can't be any issues with it. Well, if you look at the history of Bitcoin, actually there's already previously been 2 bugs that were found in the Bitcoin code, and ultimately one of them led to inflation. The other one led to, didn't really lead to much because it was found by a Bitcoin Cash developer. So the first one happened in 2010. I think the second one happened in perhaps 2016, 15. And that was found by a Bitcoin Cash developer. If you don't believe me on that, go and do your research. So there has already been 2 bugs found with Bitcoin. I think it might be a little bit unlikely that you're going to find one at this stage just because of how far things have came, but you never know. And there is the looming threat of a 51% attack that could take place for Bitcoin. And if either of those 2 scenarios played out, what would that mean for the validity and thus the value and viability of Bitcoin? You know, and these are both possibilities. The first one's already happened and the second one could happen. Okay, and actually, just to quickly break down what the 51% attack is, how these distributed ledger systems work is you have multiple people that essentially are all kind of note-keeping the ledger. And this is what gives them their power. You don't have one centralized point of attack. You've got, the more decentralized it is, the more immutable it is, essentially. But if you had 51% of the people who were validating that network, the miners, that were malicious, you could essentially put through things that weren't there and tamper with the ledger. Now, it would be a very expensive thing to do, but it could be a thing to do altogether. And what happens if something like that occurs when everyone's now levered up and we're all now looking at Bitcoin as a seriously viable alternative to the fiat systems, like is what's happening today? What happens if everyone's got it in their 401ks, BlackRock's, you know, gone to the moon with it, so on and so forth? What would that do to the price? Because that would really put, I think, a question on Bitcoin as a viable, immutable monetary system. I don't think there is necessarily an immutable monetary system unless you want to talk to the gold bugs. But that is a possibility. You know, just because Bitcoin's here, and yes, I get the argument, well, it works right now, so why do we care about the people behind it and perhaps their intent with it all, doesn't mean that there's not going to be any issues with it. And that's something else that you shouldn't just blindly think, because there are genuine things that could influence Bitcoin in perhaps an unfavorable direction to what this entire movement was spawned out of, if you believe in the narrative. you could essentially see a 51% attack. You know, if you look at BlackRock and people like that, they are some of the largest owners of Bitcoin mining, and Bitcoin mining is actually rather centralized. If you look at, I think the Binance pool has about 5% of all mining power. That's just Binance. Okay, there's larger pools out there. You know, would it be that hard for them to take up a lion's share in that, and then perhaps put a narrative forward that they want, or alterations that they want as a result of that? You know, you can put forward Bitcoin improvement proposals. And is 21 Bitcoin the only amount of Bitcoin that's ever going to be created? I don't know. As it sits right now, it looks likely, but could there be some sort of an improvement proposal or a fork? And I think with money, a large part of money is the believability in it. You know, you have to believe, if you look at the fiat systems right now, you have to believe that they're valuable. If there was ever any tampering with the belief that Bitcoin is valuable, there's a lot of unanswered questions. And this video and these videos, and we're going to shut up about Bitcoin and its origins at this point, because I think we've wound up enough people, are really just to get people to question the origins and to not believe everything that they hear. And they'll always create a goodie and a baddie. It was Shakespeare that said all the world is a stage and all the men and women in it are actors. And ultimately, I kind of believe in that. You know, they ultimately will always create a goodie and a baddie. And just like they did with the Aldrich Bill, which was kind of painted as the baddie, they then created the goodie in regards to the Federal Reserve Bill, the Federal Reserve Act, and got essentially what they wanted just through going through a different route. So be careful. Again, we are long Bitcoin, we hold Bitcoin. We are just skeptical about its origins and perhaps the true intent. And if it is the path and the road to freedom, I think certainly it's a better system than the fiat system. I think it's a lot more decentralized, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And that also doesn't mean that it's going to lead to freedom and a fairer world. And actually, again, the Federal Reserve Bill was kind of to put the power back into the hands of the people. That's what it was all about, you know, taking it away from Wall Street. Well, now we're kind of at the adverse of that. We're taking it away from the central corrupt governments and we're giving it back to the people. You know, are they just playing on that narrative to get what they ultimately might be behind through? But it was amazing for me to see how many people actually agreed with my takes and also were skeptical on Bitcoin's origins. And we will, again, like I said, shut up about this topic now, unless you guys want more videos on it. We can talk about so much stuff, but we don't want to cram too much into this video. On these walk and talks, we want to talk about interesting things as they relate to the cryptocurrency space. We want to cover things like the metaverse. Most people think the metaverse is a game. I happen to disagree. I think it's a digital representation of real life. We also want to talk about things like the Internet of Things, which is something that's very interesting, deep in, you know, cryptocurrency projects that we're interested in, everything in between, and just generally interesting topics as it relates to this technology. We are some of the biggest, or one of the biggest fans of blockchain. I built an entire career off it. I've done very well financially from it. But ultimately, I am a thinker, like many of you guys are, and girls, that I'm ultimately very, I guess, questioning of the origins of Bitcoin, the real intent, and is the narrative that most people believe the right one? I happen to think it's probably not. That's all I've got for you guys. I'm going to sign off on that note. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Thanks for watching. See you in the next.